Welcome everyone to today's lecture. We've been going through the sins week by week. For those who are new to the procedure, the first lecture is usually more abstract, philosophical, about the sin as it's understood in medieval culture, but also a little bit of modern culture. And then the second lecture will be more hardcore medieval, applying some of this stuff to the 12th and 13th centuries. We've come to greed this week, avarice. If we're working our way up Dante's Mount Purgatory, as you know, Dante imagines Mount Purgatory as purging the 7 deadly sins one by one, from the most terrible, which is pride, of course, through envy, second most terrible, anger, and then sloth, which was last week, Arcadia. And now it's getting lighter. As Dante himself says, he has on his forehead 7 P's, and he removes 1 P after he purges himself, sort of each of these sins. When he dies, he will have to go back and do it properly. Apparently still on the terrace of pride, according to Italian scholars. But anyway, he feels himself getting lighter as he gets to greed. Greed is not so bad. It's not such a terrible sin. For Dante, at least, it is one of the 3 kind of more material sins, along with gluttony and lust. And in Dante's Inferno, likewise, it's near the beginning. But with a caveat, there are the more terrible kinds of greed or avarice that Dante would put much, much further in hell. And for the people who sin that way, there's no redemption in purgatory. We don't find anyone who's a usurer in purgatory, and we'll come to that a little bit later. So, what we're going to do today, what's my promise to you? We're going to go through 4 kinds of concepts, medieval concepts of greed or avarice. Greed is just generally defined, by the way, if we take Augustine's definition, as an inordinate attachment to material things. The inordinate love of material things. What is that inordinance? What is that too much? What kind of too much is it? Is it that you love it too much or you do it too much? That distinction between the intention and the action will be important. We're going to explore this. First of all, this idea of binding to the earth. The idea that greed itself is somehow anchoring you to the world, the earth. But there's another dimension of that. The idea that through greed, the sinner becomes the earth. That they become material, they become matter through their attachment to matter. It's a dehumanization, which we'll explore there. Secondly, we will look at fraud. For those of you, again, who know Dante, you know that fraud is the bottom of everything. It's the very floor of hell. It's the souls eating each other's skulls in hate and spite and treachery. Fraud is as low as it gets. We will talk about fraud as a way into understanding the counter-natural aspects of avarice and greed. That is, that there's something about greed that is not just an inordinate love of something, but some medieval philosophers and poets would see it as well as actually against nature, as somehow doing something wrong with the body. What is that wrong? We'll look at that there. Then prodigality. Prodigality is an interesting side to avarice, because of course, what's the other side of greed? You know, the opposite, the inverse of wanting too many things, is apparently that casino mentality of, I don't care about the money, let it flush away. And of course, that is also a sin, with a huge qualification. And finally, a forgivable sin. This is where we get a bit more historical. There is, within all of this medieval philosophy of greed, the germ of an idea that it's all actually quite forgivable under certain circumstances. That of all the sins, there's something in avarice that you can just forgive off the bat. And for that, we'll need to turn to one of the great doctors of the church, and that will bring us, hopefully, to the modern day. Behind all of this, by the way, is this, I'm not sure I like it, metathesis of the 7 deadly sins. You remember, of course, that pride is the worst of the sins. Why? Because it is the sin that puts yourself above everyone else. It's the sin that would look to say, I don't need anyone else, I don't need community, I can do it all alone. It's the ultimate root of all selfishness in medieval theology, and so consequently all the other sins can kind of flow out of it. But there's this idea, and there's an article by Lester K. Little, a historian, but then maybe the most famous, Jacques Le Goff, the Annales School scholar, writing in the 80s. There's this idea that actually avarice, greed, becomes the root of all evil in medieval thought, sometime around about the same time that we get the development of a bourgeois economy. What does it mean? Well, it means that you start getting arguments that all sin flows from this attachment to material things, that you can say political corruption or personal corruption or the loss of souls, all of these things ultimately have their first cause in wanting material things rather than in that first step of I matter more than others. In practical terms, Le Goff's argument is, well, it's silly, but that pride is the arch sin of a feudal economy. In a feudal economy where you depend upon your ties with other people, where all economic activity depends upon personal agreement and oath, that pride is the worst sin. You know, in a strict pyramid where the king is at the top and the vassals are below, then pride, thinking you don't need that king, is like the most terrible of the sins. In a bourgeois economy for Le Goff, avarice is the key sin. It's the sin designed to be the worst sin in an economic situation, which we get to. In the second lecture, we will look at the origins of capitalism in the Middle Ages. But I just thought I'd throw this out here. This is one of those background issues. Okay, binding to the earth, becoming matter. I suppose we should go to Dante's Purgatory to understand this one, because it's quite literal there. As you know, on Dante's Mount Purgatory, we see the penitents purging themselves of the sins one by one with a fitting activity. So the proud have to hold an enormous boulder on their backs for 1,000 years or something like that. The envious have their eyelids sewn up with iron wire. The angry are clouded with black smoke, and the slothful are running a sort of long marathon, super marathon, round and round the mountain. With avarice, here we are. This is from, I think, a 15th century or maybe 16th century copy of the Purgatorio. The avaricious are forced to lie face down. It's as simple as that. They lie prone on their stomachs, facing the floor for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's explained this way by one of the popes who ends up there. Of course, Dante loves to put political figures in purgatory, and it's part of the fun he has. There are a lot of popes in Inferno and Purgatory, very controversially. But I think it's Pope Adrian V. Just as we failed to lift our eyes on high because they were fixed on earthly things, so justice here has turned them to the earth. So Dante makes it very literal. The avaricious are forced to just confront the material that they were attached to. They were attached to the earth, things of the world, and now they can face it and suck it up and realise everything they turned down, which was, I suppose, the more immaterial world of ideas, love, other things that anchored to the floor. It's worth noting, I suppose Dante explores this idea in further depth elsewhere. This is another depiction of that scene. That's from Gustave Doré's famous engravings of the Purgatorio in the Inferno. Here is another scene from that manuscript. This is in Inferno. This is where the avaricious are punished in Inferno. And again, there's that heavy material element, literally very heavy. Here, you can just about see, I suppose, the souls are of the avaricious and the prodigal. We'll come to them later, the people who gave away too much of their money. But the avaricious and the prodigal are forced to roll these enormous boulders with their chests. They use their chests. The reason they use their chests is because the avaricious have their fists bound together. They can't move their hands. So they're moving these boulders with their chests, and they're going in the opposite direction from the prodigal. They bash into each other, and then they shout, why do you hoard your money? Why do you spend your money like this? And it's this ferocious scene. It's weird for Dante, actually. This is a scene that makes him feel terrible. Oftentimes, Dante's kind of a bit cold. Sometimes he's quite compassionate, like when he meets the lustful in Canto 5. But here, he's like really distraught. This is so terrible. He sees some terrible things in the Inferno, but for some reason, this really strikes a chord with him. The patheticness of it, the circular nature of it, the aggression of it. Okay, so this heavy material element is there. It's heavily there in Dante. I want to go a little bit further back in time because there's this interesting element too, which goes with it, which I think is becoming the material, as I say. We could go, for example, to Crassus, 55 BC. There are two figures in Roman mythology who are supposed to have suffered this terrible fate. Crassus is one, the other is Marcus Aurelius, I think. And it's this famous execution by having molten gold poured down your throat. This is the idea. And this is told in a couple of, I suppose Ovid tells this story. I think Cicero mentions Crassus. The story is simply, you wanted all the gold, now taste it. Tell us what it tastes like. This is like the most horrifying, I think, of versions of this myth. He looks pretty relaxed, though, doesn't he, Crassus? I mean, I think I'd be, look at that languid right arm. Okay, so that's myth. Did it really happen? I don't know, but it's an important myth. I suppose you might think of another myth which goes with this. Those of you who like the James Bond movies, Goldfinger, King Midas. This is also from Ovid. Here we are. Midas, of course, who touches with everything he touches will turn to gold. Give me, says he, nor thought he asked too much, that with my body, whatever I touch, changed from the nature which it held of old, may be converted into yellow gold. It's Metamorphosis, book 11. The Midas myth, again, of course, a myth. I would note that later writers add this kind of fantastical image that Midas touches his girlfriend and she becomes solid gold. That's not actually in Ovid. But of course, you see the idea there. You see the idea there. Inordinate attachment to material things can lead to the transformation of the human nature into the material. How do medieval artists play with this idea? Well, there are several pretty disturbing ways that they do it. And there's a series of columns that turn up in Auvergne in France in the 12th century, and they're kind of unique. They're unique for showing this dragging down element of, this weighing down element of greed or avarice. Here you can see, this is a usurer actually. This inscription says, the usurer does the devil's work. And this is his urn here, where he kept his money. And this is the heavy bag. This heavy bag is important. This idea that material sinners, the greedy, have some weight around their necks which drags them down, which brings them to the earth. This gets more ugly and hairy and later in the 13th century. Again, you see the pouch here. Something that Dante explores again in the circle with Fraud is the snakes which drag down, which I find particularly horrifying. I'm sure everyone does. Again, you see being dragged. This, however, though, is a slightly more interesting take on it. Again, you see, look, the usurers. Here you can see with the pouch around their necks. Here, interestingly enough, these are clerics. You have a pope, you have a cardinal, I think, or a bishop, and you have a king here in agony being dragged down. But, and I think I'm not reading too far into this, but notice that they've become furniture, haven't they? They've become furniture. They're being sat on. And this is a theme you see time and time again. The materialistic become the material. They're ridden like they're horses, like they're not humans, or they're sat on like furniture, or they're thrown into the ground like they are the carpet or the floor. To go to sermons, just very briefly, you see this theme coming out again and again. And this is the world of preaching. This is where medieval preachers, they take to the streets, they try to bring the messages, the more complex messages of theology into ordinary language. One of the better preachers is Jacques de Vitry. He has a wonderful selection of sermons from the early 1200s. He has a great story of this guy who's really materialistic. He loves his money, and he wants to be buried with it. He wants one portion of his wealth to go to one son, one to go to the other, and he wants to be buried with the final part. And so he is buried with it. But then, since he was buried with an enormous amount of money, the family wanted to get it back at night, which is reasonable, I think it's reasonable. Opening the tomb, they saw demons stuffing the usurer's mouth with coins that had been turned into red-hot coals. You see again the theme coming through. And it's interesting that there's this attachment to food as well. Like, you wanted to be nourished, but you chose the material, and instead that became your food. That uselessness of barren metal, as it's called in other sermons. That idea of eating things. It's also this sort of anti-natural rhetoric which comes through. So binding to the earth, and becoming one with the metal. I tried to think of a modern example. Now it's interesting, there are several very imaginative modern takes on medieval thought. We could look at The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, both of which deal with these kinds of themes, both of which were written by Tolkien, who is himself a committed medievalist, master of medieval languages, who based a lot of his mythology on it. So you could think about Gollum and his attachment to the ring and how the ring makes him into the monster. But I thought the Game of Thrones would be an interesting example, if only because, I don't know, I just came across it very recently. But here we have the punishment depicted in Game of Thrones of, again, like Crassus, a golden crown, this character who wants the crown so desperately. And then they say, well, we'll give it to you finally. They melt down the gold and they pour it on his head, and he's executed that way. I think it's a fitting update of the medieval myth. Any questions about binding to the earth? Any of those analogies that I can bring out in more detail? Zoomers? I'm sure the students would have hundreds of examples. Matt Vey. Oh, hang on. Let's give you this. I think it should be working.
Can you tell a little?
It works. It's going through.
Can you tell a little bit more how this was reflected in monastery culture, maybe monastic culture? This maybe some illustrations.
Binding to the earth.
Maybe in monastic practices.
Monastic practices. It's a good question. Do we see any of these currents of binding to the earth in monastic practices? As we're going to see in the second lecture, there's a heavy discourse within certain monastic cultures of own no property whatsoever. And we associate with that with the Franciscans and the radical mendicants. So there is heavy discourse. So for example, you have, my favorite is St. Francis of Assisi, who catches one brother with, and there's a pile of coins on a mantelpiece. And the Franciscans are not supposed to own anything. No money whatsoever. Nothing's supposed to come through their hands. And Francis says, who are those coins? And the guy says, one of the brothers says, they're mine. Sorry, I was going to donate them later, or we were going to use them for something. So Francis forces him to go and pick up the coins with his mouth, one by one, and spit them onto this pile of manure. So he makes an exhibition of it, which is classic Francis of Assisi. He loves the performance, loves the exhibition. But I think it illustrates it really well. Do we take the anecdote seriously? To me, as someone who loves the Franciscan sources, it sounds dead on, like something Francis would do. But it's an example. Within the more traditional monasteries, they're owning things in common. Ownership, I'm sure it does come out. I'm sure there are anecdotes of brothers who are caught with things in their possession and then punished. But not quite in that exhibitionist, myth-making way that Francis liked to do, connecting money with food, money with manure. Okay, let's move on to fraud. Fraud and usury. And continuing with this idea of binding to the earth is going against nature. That material attachment is unnatural, and it has associations in that way. Fraud. Can any of you spot? This is Bronzino, Angelo Bronzino's An Allegory with Venus and Cupid. It's a national gallery in London. It's a beautiful painting. Fraud is there, though. Can any of you see, or does anyone know this painting, or can anyone tell me where fraud is here? I think it's one of the more chilling examples. In fact, it's the most chilling example of fraud I think I've ever seen in a painting. Where's fraud? Giacomo. You're not fraud, sorry. Okay, all right. Well, look, it's a little bit dark. It's a little bit dark.
The man is doing something probably.
Which one?
The man in the whole project.
Oh, yes. I forget who he is, actually, but he's not fraud.
He's clearly doing something with the hand.
Ah, yes. It's quite in the open, though. Whereas fraud would do things clandestinely.
There is someone at the bottom.
Ah, yes. That's actually yes, that looks like a mask. I'm not sure. Well, look, I tell you what, let's move in. Oh, Tom.
I have a theory.
Yes.
It's the apple.
The apple is fraud.
The apple is the symbol of temptation. It's the reason why mankind was expelled from paradise.
It's true. There's nothing fraudulent about the apple, though. It was quite open. If you take the apple, you'll be sinning against God. Now, fraud is horrifying, guys. If we look, let's zoom in on fraud. Here is fraud. Why is she horrifying? Well, the bland face. You notice this is the face of fraud here. Bland, pleasant face, which is important. Fraud appears from the outside to be completely fine, completely lovely. Beautiful without any feeling, I think is one way to put it. But look closer, and I know it's too dark, it's too light in here to see, but look closer, and Fraud's body is actually the twisted body of a serpent. It's a snake's body that she has. You really can't see this. As I say, it's difficult. She's a serpent, but she also has feet. But I think my favourite part of this are the hands. The hands are my favourite part. Here's one hand here, and the other hand there of Fraud. Tough question, 10 points for the answer. What's wrong with the hands? Yes. Anastasia, you're absolutely right. They are the wrong hands. This is the left hand, and yet it's the right hand, isn't it? Fraud's hands are the wrong way round. Fraud offers in one hand, you can't see it, of course, but honeycomb. She's offering you the honeycomb with one hand. But with the other hand, she's holding a small viper, a poisonous snake. Again, you can't see it there. I love this. There's a wonderful article, by the way, in the London Review of Books by Marina Warner, which talks briefly about this painting in the context of, I shouldn't say it, but in the context of universities in Britain. I won't add any gloss, but it's a chilling account she gives. It is a chilling image. The thing about fraud then is, there are two things to say here, I suppose. There's a very loaded and a very layered discourse of fraud as that deceptive crime that will offer you one thing and stab you with the venomous thing. I think that's understood. It's important that fraud must look perfect from the outside in medieval ideas of fraud, you know, and I suppose probably in modern too. This association with the serpent is important as well. Dante, again to go back to Dante, we have to get really deep into hell before we meet fraud, as I mentioned, really down near the bottom. And I think we'll go to Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali drew this image of Dante and Virgil meeting fraud. And once again, it's not unlike Bronzino's painting, if you want to see Dali's imagination. Fraud for Dante is once again a serpent's body. It's the snaking serpent's tail, which is persecuting all of these souls, who, incidentally, these particular fraudulents have committed the crime of usury, which we'll come to in just a few seconds. Just literally the next slide, we'll get to that. But it's important. Dante describes it, I'm not sure Salvador Dali does it justice here. In fact, he's feminized fraud, which is problematic, because that's not what Dante says. Dante says it's the face of an honest and virtuous man. It's supposed to be a wise man's face, serpent's body. Dante and Virgil are not taken in. Right at the beginning of the Inferno, when Dante meets Minos, the demon whose tail circles around his body to tell you how far down into hell you need to go as a sinner, Minos warns Dante, don't trust anyone you meet here in hell. And we as readers, we meet all kinds of readers, sinners, who make us want to like them. The most of all, I'm sure, Giacomo, you remember from school days, Ulysses in Inferno. And it's so seductive. Even Primo Levi, writing in Auschwitz, said, you know, Ulysses has a wonderful speech. Oh, you know, humans, you were not born to be brute beasts. You were made to soar. And it's this fantastic part of the Inferno. But as we remind ourselves, Ulysses himself is fraudulent. He looks wonderful. He sails on the high seas. What was Ulysses' mistake? Ulysses insisted to his fellow, his sailors with him, if we just sail just a little bit further, through Gibraltar, past into the Atlantic, if we go a bit further, there's adventure. And then he says, look, weren't you made to be something better than animals? Can't we do something fantastic? But we understand that the sin for Ulysses is actually the sin of fraud. He's trying to manipulate them. He wants them on his side. He actually then describes them as oars. And then my oars all sailed. But of course, the ship is wrecked. It's an impossible journey. Ulysses' problem is he was fraudulent in tricking them to come on the trip with him. And that ultimately he saw them not as people, but as material oars that he could use. Anyway, this is fraud. We could talk about, of course, that gets us away from avarice at some level, into the realm of lying, hypocrisy, and other things which are delightful to talk about. We should stick with greed and avarice for now. And we should talk about usury. This is Hieronymus Bosch. This is one of his wonderful, this is a detail from one of his wonderful paintings. This is Death and the Miser. Usury, what is this? Again, provocatively, Jacques Lakoff, a great French historian, said that, you know, before we get capitalism, we get usury. What does he mean? It's enigmatic. It's like before we get capitalism as licensed greed, if you like, the last cry of a moralistic discourse for Le Goff, who's going a bit wild, I think, is usury. What is usury? It's completely pejorative, okay? No one ever uses this word in a good way. It's only ever used as something despicable in medieval texts. How to put it? Usury it's basically, you could see it as like selling time. Usury is charging interest on a loan. It's as simple as that. But it's unnecessary interest. Now, what is unnecessary interest? I don't know. But the idea is, and so this is part of, like, big caveat number one, usury is in the eye of the beholder. If you don't think it was justified, you're paying that interest, then it's usury. And this is despicable, should be at the bottom of hell. Where's the serpent of fraud? Strike them down. There's a little bit of that going on. There are banks. They are charging interest. Some of it is reasonable. You know, in a gift-giving economy, if I give you something, you give something back. There's we accept that there's some, acknowledgement that when I gave you this, there's some reciprocation. So usury, charging interest, and I'm sure we have economists here, no one's going to argue that charging interest is immoral, even in medieval theology. However, it becomes a stick to beat people with for charging too much interest. And the idea becomes, and this is maybe just a little bit absurd, the idea becomes that what are you selling when you make a loan? If I make a loan, I give Matvey 100,000 rubles, and then I want 120,000 back. What have I sold there? Where did I make my 20,000 rubles? What have I done? So the medieval answer, there are many answers, but one medieval answer is, well, it's the time that I've sold. I gave Matvey time, but the problem there is I don't own time. Who says that I should be the one? Now, it's a bit abstract, and, there's my time, your time, but the idea is that time belongs to God, and so consequently, it was wrong for me to charge Matvey 20,000 rubles for that 2-week loan. That would be pretty extortionate, wouldn't it? Okay, so that's one theory. Another theory, I hate to say it, is I just think it's a good way to persecute people you don't like who are making a lot of money. And increasingly this is seen as the Jewish sin. And there's a whole network of associations that Christians decide to make between Jews and money lending and Jews and usury and Jews and Judas. And Judas took 30 pieces of silver and he was a usurer. And it's quite dense and it's deeply anti-Semitic, ultimately. But there it is. Okay, so some good pieces of usurious art, or usury in art. This is Giotto. This is his Last Judgment. This is in the Scrovegni Chapel. I recently read an article, it's very convincing. It says this whole chapel, if you go into this chapel, it's one of the most marvellous collections of medieval art, all done by Giotto, the first Renaissance painter, if you like. All of the walls covered in Giotto masterpieces. And they're great for the sins, because we have envy is in there, pride is in there, despair is in there. But a good article argues that actually the whole thing is a big parable against usury. And that's because the guy who commissioned all of this was a guy who had been lending money and felt guilty, and commissioned that Giotto to do the whole thing to try and make amends. But anyway, obviously, let's look at the Last Judgment. Now, obviously, as we are the Seven Deadly Sins class, we're only interested in one corner of this painting, which is not that one up there, it's this one here. This is Giotto's Last Judgment. It's obviously horrific. I'd say a few things. This looks an awful lot like Dante's Satan, and this is 1306. This is just, and Dante doesn't start writing the Inferno until 1307, I think, 1308, 1309. So that's one thing to say. But close examination of this is very grainy. There's an awful lot of money bags in here. There's an awful lot of this trading going on. And this is, I think, an enactment of usury here. So you have the usurer here offering the money bag. Or is this the one who's taken the loan? I'm not sure, the usurer. But the thing I want to just point out here is the sexual undertone. This idea of a sexual exchange which is taking place in usury. It's more than just, and why is it sexualized? Maybe you don't see it here. You will see it in a few of the things I show you in a second. But there is some kind of sexualization, I think. Why is it sexualized? Well, it's not so much that it's sexualized, it's that usury is paired with some other form of aberration, which is against nature, which is sodomy. It's actually, there's a huge association between usury and sodomy as two things which are accused as being against nature. Let's go into that for a second. Let's explore. First of all, Alexander Bernini, writing at the same time this chapel was painted. By usury, it is understood that money generates money. Here's the link. Maybe you'll see the link immediately with sexuality and sodomy. Money generates money, but money, by means of this craft, reproduces itself as if by impregnation and birth. So there's the sexuality, obviously. The problem, guys, for usury, and this is, the medieval writers get hung up on this again and again and again, is this anxiety about where does the money come from? Where does the value come from? How do we get excess value through money, moving money around? No, there's no more money. I give Matvey 100,000 rubles, he gives me 120,000 back. Why is there that extra money involved in a transaction that should just be giving one thing to the other and getting it back? Where does this growth come from? And the metaphor that they develop is something almost like putrefaction, almost like maggots coming out of an apple. Why do we get something out of nothing? Why do we get this outgrowth, this evil outgrowth out of something? This is the metaphor that they develop. Here's from a 13th century manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Usurers sin against nature by wanting to make money, give birth to money, as a horse gives birth to a horse, or a mule to a mule. Why a horse? I don't know. But anyway, that's what he chose. It's that anxiety that it's something generating without what they would consider a natural process. Something being born without a natural process. And you can see, therefore, the link with sodomy, a sexual activity supposedly without any natural element to it. Here you see, there's an awful lot of these depictions which also associate money, and usurious money in particular, with feces. Again, this idea that the body's wiring has been made unnatural through all this money activity. This is from a manuscript. This is from Caesarius of Heisterbach, his Dialogue of Miracles. This is a collection of little parables and exemplar stories. The novice asks the monk a load of questions. Classic storytelling device, get the novice to ask the master questions and we learn a lot. Usury seems to me a very grievous sin and one most difficult to cure, says the novice in good faith. The monk, the master, says, you're right. Every other sin has its periods of intermission. Usury never rests from sin. Though its master be asleep, it never sleeps, but always grows and climbs. It grows, it generates. So then, the anxiety about usury is something growing without there being some natural cause for it to grow. Something against nature, which is like a vine growing corruptly. It's the idea, and I suppose, it's just that anxiety that money begets money without there being excess value involved. It would be interesting to get the views of some economists later on how that reflects, or how inaccurate that is. Just to say another point about Dante and another point about the Inferno. You see there, by the way, there's Dante's, this is another version of Dante's Fraud in the same scene. Again, it's feminized, which is interesting. A deliberate choice from the illustrators to make it feminine and not masculine. I don't know why. You saw with Bronzino, it's a feminine fraud as well. It's something interesting to explore. Here are the usurers over here. Once again, you see them with their pouches. And it's a kind of orgy that's taking place among them, although I doubt there's much pleasure involved. It's a pretty horrible scene. Just to hit home that point, usury is right next to sodomy in Dante's Inferno. They are, both of them, considered sins against nature. Okay, so far it's been heavy. Pretty heavy going in some ways. Let's move on to prodigality. Are there any questions about usury? There's probably much more to say about it. Any questions about usury or fraud, for that matter? Tom? Oh, let's give you the mic.
I was wondering, Pete, whether you could talk about the religious aspect of usury, i.e., that it was forbidden for Catholics to engage in this activity, and hence religious minorities in Europe, such as the Jews, often occupied themselves with this business.
I don't need to say anything now. You said that. You've made that point wonderfully. Yes. So, generally speaking, money lending is forbidden to Christians for the reason that it is a sin against. Whoops, that's a wonderful howl. For the reason that it is a sin against, that really got me here. It is a sin against, they're all down there in the Inferno. It's a sin against, it's selling time. Yes, so Christians are forbidden from lending money, so consequently a lot of Jewish people take up the role of money lending because there's a gap in the market. Jewish people are the only minority through vast parts of Europe, the only religious outsiders, so they take on that role. Doctoring is another job that a lot of Christians refuse to be doctors for reasons I'm not sure about. So we get a lot of Jewish doctors and necromancers. Yeah, good point. So yes, so usury then takes on this. It's the job of the outsider. So it's no surprise that it becomes a kind of associated with that kind of sin. Other questions? Any Zoom questions? Was that cry a question or? Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to prodigality. I mean, so what is the opposite of greed? So arguably the opposite of greed is precisely prodigality. Now, the counter virtue to greed, I should say, is charity, or generosity rather, generosity. And this needs no explanation. So often in medieval manuals you'll have the 7 deadly sins and then you'll have the 7 cardinal virtues, the ways that you can solve these 7 deadly sins. They're often paired together. And greed is often, the comparison is with generosity, which makes perfect sense. But there is a line in generosity. There's a line over which you may not step, which is the line of prodigality. So what is prodigality? Well, I mentioned earlier that in Dante's Inferno we have not just the avaricious but also the prodigal fighting with these boulders in that pit, this circular pit. And quite simply, for Dante, prodigality is spending without measure, spending money without measure. So really it is the casino, it's the sin of the casino. It's the sin of, I'm just going to spend all of this, I'm just going to throw this money, put it all on red, put it all on black. Who cares? And, you know, what is there to say about it? I suppose you might see this kind of discourse come up in the Reformation in Europe in the 1500s. This idea, well, there's so much religious wealth, the church has so much gold, you know, isn't this in itself prodigal? Isn't this in itself spending without measure? That discourse comes up a lot. But of course, at stake in all of this is what the measure is. There are two things actually at stake. First of all, who is the judge and how do we judge what is measured to be an acceptable amount of spending? Within that is the second problem here, which is, so some degree of acquisition is therefore acceptable. Some degree of acquisition is therefore okay. This is kind of like the route out of avarice, if you like, as sin. But anyway, spending without measure. I suppose the big parable of this is the prodigal son narrative. This is from Luke's Gospel. You know the prodigal son, I'm sure. You know, do you remember this parable? He goes, yeah, so the father has 2 sons, and they both want their inheritance now. And so it gives them both their inheritance. One son is quite prudent with it. The other son goes off and spends it all. And this is a tapestry, the prodigal among the harlots, from the Netherlands in the 1520s. And here we see the prodigal son in the middle. He's just having a wonderful time. He's spending his money on prostitutes. He's spending his money on gambling, wine, grapes, you know, whatever. Lovely flowers. It's interesting actually to get a sense of what is luxurious at this point. This tapestry is actually the most luxurious thing. This would have been woven with gold thread. I mean, these things are, you know, you could buy the entire Schlumberger building with this tapestry alone, I'm sure. So that's actually kind of an ironic part here. It's a prodigal image of a prodigal son. So in the parable of the prodigal son, he goes off and he spends all of this cash and he has a wonderful time, and then he has nothing left. And he goes through this torturous transformation, which is, what am I now? What do I do now? You know, he's in great shame, self-hate, self-torture, and then eventually self-understanding. And he comes back to his father and says, can I come back to you and be your servant? And so the father then forgives him and says, you know, and then was it the fatted calf? You know, they said, right, we'll eat the fatted calf tonight and we'll celebrate your return. The other son says, this is not fair. You know, he went off and had all this good time and now he's just come back and everything's fine. He gets everything back to normal. Whereas I was good and nothing, I didn't get anything. I didn't get to have all the good time. And the father says, yes, well, but, you know, you've been good. You've been good all the way through. But he has lost himself and now found himself. So it's that redemptive narrative. Classic Jesus Christ, isn't it? This is a favourite. It's a favourite, particularly in 13th century France, actually. This is from the Louvre. This is from the late 13th century. This is the parable of the prodigal son. This is on a casket. So this is someone wants to be buried, and they want the allegory of the prodigal son on there. You know, anything for when finally the day comes for the final judgment, you can point to that and say, look, I did learn my lesson. I spent a lot of money getting this ivory done. I knew where I went wrong. In terms of prodigality, I suppose we could talk about the measure in a second. The first thing is that the idea of self-discovery through waste, or rather self-loss through waste, is quite interesting. This idea that through the activity of spending your money stupidly, not wisely at all, wasting everything, through that loss, something can be discovered, which I think is quite a classic idea in medieval theology and probably in modern contemporary wisdom, that by going to the bottom, by losing it all, you realise the value, blah, 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 blah. This is well dramatised in this Courtois d'Arras. This is an early 13th century play. This is, by the way, an illustration of a medieval theatre which is quite good. We don't have many. I don't know how they did these pyrotechnics, but you know, look, it's all possible. It's all possible with prodigal spending. This, again, is the story of a young man, and it's not explicitly about the prodigal son from Luke's Gospel, but it does rehearse the story. And it's, again, about a young man who loses everything. And at the end, we have this, and he loses everything and comes back to his father. You know, he's a good knight, again. Your wrongdoing doesn't matter 2 points since you have come to know yourself. There are other stories from medieval sermons, again, about young men who go off and lose their horses and then discover who they really are. We're going to see next week with Lust how an important part of romance literature is also about this losing oneself. But through love, it's a different kind of losing oneself and finding oneself. Rendering yourself anonymous. Getting to the point of having lost everything to such an extent that you are nothing. You become abject. And then in that moment of abjection, realizing who you really should be. So prodigality can be this vehicle, like lust, as you'll see next week, can be a vehicle for radical self-understanding, radical self-redemption through losing it all. I think that's kind of clear. So that's one thing. And you see there that prodigality is actually saved, isn't it? It's saved as a sin. It's not quite so bad. So as long as you can do the self-discovery afterwards, it's actually better, isn't it? I think of like Hegel's master-slave dialectic. You know, there are some situations where to be in a situation where you can change renders you more spiritually virtuous than not. And I think that with prodigality, we see that. As long as you can you spend the money, do as much spending as you like, as long as you find yourself in return, it's all saved. You're not going to be in Dante's hell pushing the boulders around with your chest, losing all your hair. Which isn't it? It seems, again, you can see there's some hierarchy there. The avaricious have their fists bound. The prodigal just have all their hair gone, which actually happens to a lot of us anyway. So, you know, it's kind of silly. All right, so prodigality, it is redeemable. That's important. It is redeemable. And to see the roots of that redemption in theology, which is a little slower to come up to literature and the sermons, the hardcore theology is a little slower. Prodigality implies excess in giving, but deficiency in retaining and acquiring. Okay, so this is one of the terms on which prodigality is a sin. I wanted to ask the students who this quote is from, because I know you're going to guess this. Who wrote this? Who's arguing that prodigality is a deficiency in retaining and acquiring? Who might argue that there's this problem, that prodigality is at one end of the spectrum, greed is at the other, and we should be aiming for the middle? I know one of you is going to get this. I don't know, we'll wait and see if a voice comes out here and shouts the name. All right, I'll give you another clue, Zoomers. One more clue. If I show you this collection of circles, like this map, someone just say the name. So here we are. So this is in this mind of this medieval mystery thinker, who I'll explain who it is in a second. Prodigality is down here, greed is up there, and therefore there is the golden mean in the middle. So you value too little in prodigality, you value too much in greed, and there should be this middle virtuous state which, note, appreciates value. So value is then incorporated back into a Christian theological schema, appreciating the value of things. The reason I'm mentioning this is quite a long way away from it binds you to the floor. You know, your money bag is the thing that's going to lead you to face the ground and to be absorbed in the earth, or to lose your natural substance as a human. This is much more of a step back from that kind of radical monastic discourse. This is, no, appreciate value according to reason. If you're within the mean, it's great. So prodigality actually helps this particular mystery theologian. I can't believe they haven't guessed it, even the circles. No, nothing. Prodigality actually kind of opens up a space. Focusing on prodigality as a sin and thinking about it opens up a space to allow a value, an appreciation of value as something healthy and redeemable and theologically okay. Right, well, I'll have to tell you who that was then, I suppose. It's Thomas Aquinas. Guys. It's Thomas Aquinas. We did lots of circles earlier, and we'll come back to him now. A forgivable sin, then. This is the final part of the lecture. The idea that avarice is somehow forgivable. We need to broach this because this is the meta-discourse. This is the meta-discourse for Aquinas and others. Well, not from Aquinas, sorry, for historians like Jacques Le Goff at some level. For other sort of big picture historians who've done a history of greed, there is an idea that, okay, well, and you might think of Max Weber, you know, there are certain theological, intellectual, political discussions which render some degree of greed, you know, morally, not just morally neutral, but morally, you know, okay. Acquisition itself has some virtue. And you saw there with Aquinas, deficiency in retaining and acquiring. So you can be deficient then. It can be a theological problem. It can be a spiritual sin. It can be part of, in fact, a deadly sin to be deficient in acquiring things, to not acquire, to not retain. So if you have money in your bank account and not to retain it. So this, now think about this for a second. Does this mean that someone who says, well, I'm going to give away all my money to charity, you can say, well, this is prodigal at some level. You're deficient in retaining. And why is that? What are the grounds for seeing that as a failure of you spiritually? But this is important. I mean, I'm not a theologian, all right, and I'm not engaged with contemporary Christianity. I'm not interested in it, if I'm honest with you. But that is a discourse which rages in theological circles today, and it's one of the great vulgar criticisms made. Oh, if the church is so serious about solving poverty, shouldn't it start with selling all its properties and selling all of its treasures and blah, blah, blah? Well, I think here in Aquinas you see a defense of that sometimes value needs to be appreciated for what it is. I can't defend it in the contemporary world, but I know that a medieval defense of this would be, within things are intrinsic values which cannot be reduced to others. So that is, the golden chest which keeps a relic has a certain spiritual value which cannot simply be substituted by saying, we'll sell that for money, which we then give to the poor. You can't reproduce that. We need to appreciate, in medieval theology at least, the intrinsic value sometimes that these precious objects have. They do a certain spiritual good. Not everything, therefore, is reducible to exchange to just money, which can be spent elsewhere. There's not a fungibility, I suppose is the word, an infinite fungibility of goods. Some goods have an intrinsic value and should be appreciated for that value. So then this leads us to avarice as forgivable sin, if you like, or at least it opens the door to it. Here's Le Goff then. Purgatory, by making the salvation of the usurer possible, contributed to the birth of capitalism. And, you know, Le Goff is heroic in many ways, or was. I suppose he died about 10 years ago. Le Goff was heroic as a historian, and big brushstrokes, extremely exciting. If you're going to read one medieval history book, it might as well be one of Le Goff's, like The Medieval Imagination, or one of those. Terrific. But here, you see, it's just such a big brushstroke. I just find it very difficult. There are so many big brushstrokes there. The birth of capitalism being one of them. Purgatory, making the salvation of the usurer possible. Not Dante's purgatory. There's no usurer on his terrace of avarice. That's still unforgivable. You're still in with the fraudulent there for Dante. But okay, let's take this at face value at some level. There is the possibility of salvation for the usurer. We do get that beginning, and I think it is there with Aquinas. I'm going to do a few sort of silly graphs now with Aquinas, and I think the quotation we've already had about prodigality, or the image you've already seen about appreciating value, is probably the most important thing. But these are kind of the background to it. This is the Summa Theologiae. Not everyone in this room has been introduced to Thomas Aquinas, so I'll just say like 30 seconds about him. Sorry guys, I know the Zoomers, you had this last week, you can make a cup of tea. Aquinas is, I would say, without comparison, the most systematic thinker that the Middle Ages produced, which is a great compliment. They call him the medieval computer. Why? Because he had an answer for everything. But he is absorbing all debates and almost digesting them. There's a lot of gustatory metaphors with Aquinas. He digested everything and then produced his answer to every question. So any question you can think of, Aquinas has an answer. Does God exist? He has an answer. He proves it through logic. How many angels are there in the universe? He has an answer. Is it wrong to want the things that your brother or sister has? He has an answer. He has an answer for everything. But he uses reason, and he uses Aristotle most of all, and also Arabic philosophers who commented on Aristotle. It's quite important. But it's Aristotle here who I think is the key. He is the keystone in understanding all of this, because Aristotle, of course, had the idea of the golden mean. And you remember in the Nicomachean Ethics, for Aristotle, it's not just about your virtues can go both ways. You know, you could be too prideful and not prideful enough, too ambitious and not ambitious enough. The golden mean is what to strive for, and Aquinas really absorbs that. He is a Dominican, so is he a monk? Well, in every other respect, he's a monk. He lives a religious life. He's a Dominican. He's allowed to be out in the world. He's not living cloistered. He sits at a desk for 40 years and writes. That's all he does. I think that's the only story of St. Thomas. And then he has a mystical vision at the end and says, what a waste of time all my writing was. But that, and then dies. There really is no other life story to Thomas. He was kidnapped at one point, but, you know, there's nothing else to say. He just wrote. He's the perfect SAS professor. You know, this is what we need. Someone who just sits and writes for 40 years. For Aquinas then, this is where we get to with Avarice, and this is crucial. And this is in his Summa Theologiae, the great work. This is in Secunda Secundae, which is the part of the Summa Theologica, which is about ethics. If we had a copy in the library, it would be like 4 of these bookshelves would be taken up by that Summa Theologiae, by the way. It's just an enormous work. And here he talks about, he distinguishes with avarice, and it basically gets to a point of why is avarice, you know, how bad is avarice? He starts to think about where it stands in the great ranking of sins and how redeemable it is. And he makes the distinction that the thing about avarice is that it is too much attachment to a useful good. And he distinguishes it against, therefore, a delightful good. Now, you and I could spend a lot of time thinking about the problem here of who says things that are useful are not also delightful, things that are delightful are not also useful. What's the distinction between the two? Why is lust a delightful good and not a useful good when lust can cause procreation? Well, look, these things are all good points, and don't worry, Aquinas would answer all of them thoroughly. But that distinction, that avarice itself, and he says it explicitly, it's wanting too much of the things which are good for you. Material possessions for Aquinas, therefore, are things which have an end, which can be good. Which it sounds so obvious now, but it's freeing. It is liberating. It's like a weight off your shoulders when you read this. That it's not just a constant discourse of black and white. You know, material things corrode your soul. They are unnatural. Wanting money out of money is unnatural. The white part of that black and white discourse is total poverty, the highest poverty, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, which is, you know, one of the most exciting ideas politically that's ever been produced, I think. Or certainly Giorgio Agamben thinks so. But with Aquinas, we're not there. We're out of that black and white discourse. We are in a soothing, misty grey. He then talks about the... we might also wonder, well, why is an attachment to a delightful good worse than an attachment to a useful good? Well, you know, you want things which are useful, and then you get caught up with it. It's like a kind of temptation. It's a kind of temptation which starts out of thinking about others, I suppose. I need this money to help feed the people around me. I need this material good. I need, you know, a bigger house would be nice. You know, the kids can run around. You know, it can start with that kind of temptation, and then it leads into greed. I just want it because I do, because it's overtaken me. I think with Aquinas then, and whereas the delightful good, you know, I want this food, I want this, you know, this sexual encounter, you know, this is obviously about the individual. So really behind this is actually a philosophy of evil that depends upon its relationship with the community. This is the silly diagram now. Oh no, it's not. Here's just a quote from Aquinas. External goods are necessary for him to live in keeping with his condition of life. This is what is meant by avarice, which is defined as immoderate love of possessing. We've been through this with the other sins, those who are on Zoom, but notice again the immoderate love. Time and time again, we've seen with the 7 deadly sins that what makes them deadly, where you go over the line from reasonable behavior to deadly sinful behavior, is usually, and it's usually that word love, unfortunately. It's cherishing, it's holding that thing and wanting it. So anger is not a deadly sin for Augustine until you start enjoying your anger, you start cherishing the anger. Envy is not so terrible in slander, as Lucian told us, students will remember from the seminar, until that moment when you start enjoying the slander. You're enjoying the criticism for criticism's sake. It's not just about correcting someone's flaw. Did you hear what he did? It's terrible, and that sort of thing shouldn't happen. It becomes, did you hear what he did? It's terrible, and that sort of thing shouldn't happen. It's that horrible slip from something which has a use to something which you just enjoy. And again, you see it here with Aquinas. Immoderate love of possessing. Rather, it's useful and I need it and I should acquire it, to it's useful and I need it and I should acquire it. It's that change in character where you yourself start to love the thing. Okay, here's the silly diagram then. And the reason I've built this silly diagram is it really does give us insight, because Aquinas, in a second part of dealing with this, in the Summa Theologiae, reveals himself in a way, because he entertains the possible ranking of avarice. And for a second he entertains the possibility that it is the worst sin, but then reverses himself. And he does it on these terms, and it is a visual. This is like one of those examples where I think we need the visual. Because greed, okay, so he says, first of all, he says, right, that there's a possibility, right, that a sin is really defined, like how bad is the sin, by how much you have been lured towards something. And that's over here. This is the purple-pink axis. If you've been lured towards some kind of good, right, you want something else, if that's the kind of sin, then this is how we might rank it. So like in pride, right, you're lured to sort of total power and total self-realization and control. Total control and dominance. And you're kind of being lured towards God's power. So in this sort of topsy-turvy way, you've been lured by the biggest good there is. You know, you wanted some kind of power in the world, which is one of the best goods that there is, God's power. And so it's understandable. It's like the biggest magnet there is that's pulled you in. So if you are proud in one ranking of the sins, at least it's quite understandable that you were proud. You know, you weren't tempted by something small, you were tempted by something big. It was a huge magnet that pulled you in, it wasn't a tiny little one. So your will, therefore, and you understand the difference here, your will has to be much stronger to resist pride than to resist, like, eating too many cakes, right? Eating too many cakes, small enough. You know, I find it difficult, but it can be done. But the will to say, I am nothing without other people, which is anti-pride, that's a huge step. So then the body, okay, is in the middle. Okay, it's fairly tempting, it's fairly big, you know, it's a fairly tempting good. But the weakest good is material things. So Aquinas entertains this. So if in terms of the good desired, the size of the magnet that pulled you in, avarice is like basically the smallest, because material things are smaller, less substantial, less attractive than God's power or other people's bodies. And so consequently, you know, you failed. It's the worst sin. Aquinas entertains that, and other writers will go on to make that clearly their thesis. Why is money the root of all evil? Because it's the little tiny thing which you shouldn't have been drawn to, which opens the way to the bigger, more terrible sins. But Aquinas then goes down to the other definition of sin. It's about the kind of good that you have corrupted through your sin. What good have you destroyed through your sin? And there, of course, there's no competition. Pride is destroying God's good. You say you don't need God. At the most proud and hubristic, they say there is no God. They're like Simon Magus flying up, doing magic tricks, pretending to get someone to come back from the dead by poking them with a stick and saying, well, look, there's no God. You know, so, you know, worship me, the magician. That's the worst kind of, you know, so that's kind of the good that you've corrupted in that sphere is obviously the highest good. So material things would be the lowest. You've only corrupted the world of material exchange. It's important, though, because Aquinas does make that point. He's keen to show that there is a ranking of the sins. He's keen to entertain the opposite, and he's keen to therefore argue that we should all give ourselves a little bit of a break from avarice, because it's not so terribly terrible, after all. Look, you know, one of the cliches of a lecture about avarice and greed is to now show an image of Wall Street, the movie, and Gordon Gekko, which I wanted to resist, but I didn't resist it, which I think I hate myself for. But I now have an image of Michael Douglas as Gordon Gekko in that film from the 80s. You know, of course, this is famous where he makes his speech about greed being good. I mean, how are we to understand it? Of course, we're also to laugh at him, aren't we? We're also to always have him at the end of a PowerPoint about greed, saying, well, look, you know, the discourse of greed has now got to this point, or whatever. I thought I'd mention Thomas Piketty here, just a brief quote. We know something about billionaire consumption, but it's hard to measure some of it. Some billionaires are consuming politicians, others consume reporters, and some consume academics. Look, discourses of greed are obviously still there in different ways, but you see that some of the same concerns come up. The unnaturalness of greed, you can see there. The consuming, the making into matter is definitely still there. I'm not sure if I have a thesis about what greed is in the modern world. I don't think I want to do it. I do think that these associations that we see with fraud and deception as something against nature, I think we see those in different ways. I have a painting here, Mario Donizetti from the 90s. I think that sort of turning away from nature, or that making into matter, making into the skeletal, making it into the material object, I think is present there. The turning away, the hugging the material, some of the sexualizing too. The discourses are still there. The discourse about becoming matter is definitely still there. And I think that the popularity of those movies, or Game of Thrones, or Lord of the Rings, you see those discourses still there. They still speak to us. The only thing is, I wanted to end on the point that it is depressing, however, I think, to have a binary imagination of greed as something which corrodes the soul. And I wonder, the mythology is out there. I just wondered, I was looking and casting around in my memory for academic works that tried to break this kind of simplistic view of greed and look at it in new ways. And I remembered the work of the anthropologist Daniel Miller. Maybe you know this guy, the anthropologist. But anyway, it's sort of like you could see Thomas Aquinas in this work. Stuff makes an excellent point of studies of material attachments. So if the medieval theology of material attachments, this is my final point, by the way, the lecture is over after this. If the medieval ideal of material attachments time and time again makes the point that it brings you to the ground, it binds you to the floor, it corrodes your soul, it is unnatural, whereas Aquinas starts to loosen that. Daniel Miller makes a study of material attachments in, I think it's 2000s England. And he starts looking at the objects that people possess, their possessions. And it's a fascinating study. Yes, there are interviews, but also he notices that people with, I'm not going to make this too simplistic, I hope, people with more social attachments, with more life outside their own homes, have more objects and take more interest in collecting, itemizing, obsessing over their objects. It's a complicated book. I do like it. But it's another way to understand this. For Miller, conversely, it's precisely your material attachments which make soul. If there is such a thing as soul, it's defined by Miller perhaps as your social life, as your life in a community, as your attachment to other people, as you're living outside of a selfish individual bubble with other people, being in the world. And this is equated with this making through. So making through the possession, making through the material, making the material a way to enrich and grow the individual as a social being. I thought it was a fun place to end as a way of thinking about this centuries-long debate about what material does to the soul. I thought it was a fun place to end. Okay, so those final questions then, which I'll leave you with, just sort of ways of thinking about all of this material, ways of preparing for our seminar discussion later. What values underscore ideas that material attachments corrode the soul? We've seen lots of different discourses in which the soul has been lost or destroyed through material attachment. What, however, are the values underscoring those? And we can see different values at different moments in all of our examples. What are those values? Let's start thinking about the terms in which this is made into a pathology. Under what historical conditions has greed been forgivable? Do you really think it was a historical development? Would you like to agree with Le Goff that the beginning of a bourgeois economy is the beginning of a forgivable greed? Is that too simplistic? I mean, I think it is quite simplistic, but is it the starting point for a more interesting, more complex study that you might like to do? And finally, how important is deception or fraud in the pathologization of greed? Is it possible to have a totally honest or a natural greed? Do you find in all discourses, like Thomas Piketty's about greed, some element of dishonesty and unnaturalness? Is that still there? Or is it possible to have a discourse about greed as a purely ethical issue that has no associations with what it should be natural or what should be honest? Okay, that is the end. We will come back later for a lecture on the origins of medieval capitalism. Are there any questions from Zoom or from any of you guys? Tomasz.
Has
Oh, yes. Okay, we're going to hear a question from Zoom. Let's have a question from Tomasz while we're waiting. Yeah.
My question is about why in the Catholic Church do we have this institution of celibacy and why we don't have it in the Orthodox Church. And I'm asking this because my wife asked me this question. She's not religious, but she grew up in Russia, so she's like, in Russia, priests are allowed to have wives. And she asked me why in Poland priests are not allowed to have wives. So I replied with the most convincing theory that I have ever heard, which was namely that the Catholic Church was very concerned about dividing or claims on property of the church that would come from children, legitimate children of its priests. So do you, as a medieval historian, do you have a view, or maybe you can tell us a little bit about debates in that period about this, the status of celibacy in the Catholic Church? Because it's, of course, connected, I think, with possibly the sin of greed that, as Martin Luther pointed out, corrupted the institution of the Catholic Church at that time.
I would give a simple answer, a really simple answer. You already have a good theory, so that could be one answer. The simple answer is, when do we get clerical celibacy in Catholicism or Western Christianity? When does that happen? And it happens in the 1070s. So the first thing, the simple answer is, well, it was a decision made after the split, the great split between East and Western churches in 1054, the Great Schism. So it's a policy change after that time. So it's rooted, so that's a cop-out answer, isn't it? Well, the reason is that it was a policy that happened in Rome a bit later. So there's no great ideological rift. It's just there happened to be a movement that called clerical celibacy a little bit later. Why do we get it, though? In the 1070s, it's quite easy to explain, actually, at one level. There's this whole debate about who are our priests in the 1070s. And basically, I don't want to give it like a mafia overtone, but there's an anxiety that basically it's the people, that, as you say, there is a lot of wealth involved in taking high church office, and becoming a priest is quite a nice thing to become. And there are a lot of people who are paying for the opportunity, and especially to be bishops too. So they're paying, and they call this simony, where you pay, say, I'd like to be priest, here we go, this is the bribe, But there's this idea that no one's educated and no one's living a good life, that we've got all these priests, and why is that a problem? Well, on the one hand, right, we don't have educational networks and so on, haven't really begun. There are a lot of uneducated and illiterate priests in the late 1000s. But it starts to become a problem because the Pope in Rome gets it into his head that he needs to change everything. And we're talking about several popes, but Gregory VII is the big one. Pope Gregory, who writes a manifesto called the Dictatus Papae, which basically makes out that, that basically Europe is going to become a spiritual realm with a spiritual overlord. This is his plan. It's like a 100-year plan, if you like, a 200-year plan. And he basically almost achieves it. It's kind of this secret document, which is just found in the Vatican archives much later. The Dictatus Papae. But Pope Gregory starts going across the Alps and starts preaching that you need clerical purity. And it's kind of, you could say it's in reaction to the fact that there are loads of illiterate priests who are gambling, fornicating. There's a lot of accusation of sodomy. Again, these are just in the eye of the beholder, I think. But it's a big reform movement that happens. It's like a zealous movement. We must make the church pure again. And it happens in Rome and around. So, millions of answers. Is it just that there were more impure priests? But the discourse quickly shifts. It's not enough to say no one should pay to be a priest. They should be pure people. They should be like the apostles. That's what they should be. That's what a presbyter should be. That's what it is. A stand-in. First apostles. So that discourse grips Rome. They call it the Reform. Some have argued, like Jonathan Riley Smith, that the whole project of that was to make every single person a monk. So it's understandable. Start with the priests. Everybody in Europe should be pure. The ideal world was Jerusalem would come to earth tomorrow, the heavenly city would descend, and we, all of us who are living, are already perfect. We're already the citizens who deserve to live in the heavenly Jerusalem. So we start with having lots of monks, and we start with the priests, make them pure, and then everyone else will follow. Of course, maybe thankfully, I don't know, it doesn't happen. It's a policy which is situated in the 1070s. It need not have happened. I think it happens because of a movement that sweeps up a lot of European intellectuals. Did the Zoom question come through? Which Arseny is it? Oh, sorry, Arseny.
It was a little misunderstanding. Everything is clear to me, actually.
This is just what you want to hear, isn't it? Are there any other questions, guys? I said that in a way that discourages you from asking questions, I know. Right, so look, guys, from the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate you turning up to this lecture. It's really kind, and appreciate your time. There is another lecture, don't feel obliged, okay? There is another lecture at 5:40, which will be about the medieval origins of capitalism. We'll talk about the highest poverty, which is this Franciscan idea of owning nothing, which just goes really, it's a fascinating, Agamben calls it like the most radical experiment in basically communism. He doesn't call it communism, but the most radical experiment in thinking another kind of political outside of the confines of the law in Western history. So Agamben loves this. He wrote, of course, his book, The Highest Poverty, towards the end of his Homo Sacer series. In many ways, he sees St. Francis and the spiritual Franciscans as the answer to the problem of Homo Sacer. So we'll deal with that, which is philosophically perhaps the most interesting part of these two lectures. We'll also deal with the medieval origins of capitalism. There'll be a tiny bit Marco Polo in there and his voyage, a little bit of the Mongols, and yeah, that's basically it. All right, thanks, guys.